This book is titled The Documents from Old Testament Times by D. Winton Thomas, editor. We found in the public domain, public access, so we shouldn't have any copyright problems via this video in regards to this book. Who was D. Winton Thomas, editor? Well, we didn't find much about him, only that he was born 26 January 1901, 18 June 1970, and he was a British scholar of Hebrew. He was Regius Professor of Hebrew in the University of Cambridge, an ancient academic chair at the University of Cambridge founded by King Henry VIII in 1540. At the University of Cambridge in England from 1938 to 1968. He was one of the first pupils of Godfrey Rolls Driver. Known as G.R. Driver, was an English Orientalist noted for his studies of Semitic languages and Assyriology. His father was considered the most distinguished British Hebraist of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He also played rugby for Wales. And it suggested you look at Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartens there. He must have had something to do with that. And here's his selected writings. You can find a complete biography of David Winton Thomas in Peter R. Ackroyd and Barnabas Linda's edition, Words, Dance, Meanings. Essay presented to David Winton Thomas on his retirement from the Regius Professorship of Hebrew in the University of Cambridge, 1968. Cambridge University Press, 1968, paragraphs 217 to 228. And some references and some academic offices that he probably held. And he was succeeded by John Emerton, a British Anglican priest, theologian and academic. He was Regius Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge from 1968 to 1995. The Documents from Old Testament Times by D. Winton Thomas, editor. Documents from Old Testament Times, translated with introduction and notes by members of the Old Society for Old Testament Study and edited by D. Winton Thomas. Possibly published 1958 or so forth. Preface. The Society for Old Testament Studies was founded in January 1917. At a meeting held in January 1956, the Society decided to mark its 40 years of existence by the publication of a volume, which would be the fourth of a series. The People and the Book, edited by A.S. Peake, was published in 1925. Record and Revelation, edited by H. Wheeler Robinson, 1938, and The Old Testament and Modern Study, edited by H. H. Rowley in 1951. It was the Society's wish that this latest volume should consist of a selection of non-biblical documents illustrative of the Old Testament, designed to meet the needs more particularly of teachers of Scripture in schools, of the clergy, and of others who are not professional scholars. The Society did the author the honour of entrusting him with the editorship of the volume, and he was given complete freedom in the planning of it and in the choice of contributors. The aim throughout the volume has been to relate each document as closely as possible to the Old Testament and to bring out relevant points of interest touching history, chronology, archaeology, religion, literature, geography, and so on in illustration of the Old Testament. Not all Israel's story is told in the Old Testament. It has to be supplemented by the evidence of ancient documents discovered by archaeologists, inscriptions on clay, stone, seals and coins, and writings on potsherds, papyrus and leather. Some part of the story it is the purpose of this volume to tell. Some of the documents here discussed were found in Palestine itself, but mostly they were discovered in countries surrounding Palestine, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Syria and Moab. While Israel is not without her testimony to herself, it is for the most part the witness of her neighbours which is met with in the pages of this volume. Considerations of length have inevitably imposed a limitation upon a number of selected documents. Some of those included have long been known. Others are of more recent discovery. Common to them all is the contribution which, in greater or lower or lesser degree, they make to the better understanding of the history and of the life and thought of Israel, set as she was amidst the peoples of the ancient Near East. The contributors have been required to conform to the general plan of the volume, but, apart from this, have been allowed to treat the texts assigned to them in their own way, and the views that they express are their own. The selected texts, whether presented in full or in extracts, have all been translated afresh from the original documents. Each text or group of texts is accompanied by an introduction, notes and bibliography. The bibliographies consist of the main authorities and are not intended to be exhaustive. As far as possible, works written in English have been selected, but some works in French, German and Italian have also been included. In a few cases where works in English are few, literature in foreign languages predominates. While exact uniformity in such a work as this is not easy to attain, every effort has been made to secure as great a degree of it as possible. The text of the revised version has been used throughout, and the names of persons and places have been spelled in the forms familiar from it. Egyptian names appear in forms most likely to be familiar to the reader. Hebrew and other Semitic words are transliterated in such a way as to convey to the non-Hebraist an indication of their approximate pronunciation. It is a pleasure to express thanks to those who thanks are due, and he does that. It is their hope, as it was also the authors, that they have succeeded in bringing together material which is not readily accessible yet, which is of considerable interest to all students of the Old Testament. D. Winton Thomas. And there's a list of the contributors. List of illustrations, contents continued, general index and index of biblical references, acknowledgements, abbreviations. Note on the editing of the text. Words within square brackets represent restorations of the text. Words within round brackets are insertions made for the better understanding of the text. Dots indicate a lacuna in the text. Was that like a gap or something missing or something? Something undecipherable or something? Introduction. The documents selected for inclusion in this volume are arranged in 5 main groups. The first consists of documents written in cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing, and in the Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian and Ugaritic languages. Ugaritic being the language of the text from Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit. The second consists of documents written in Egyptian, the third of one document only written in Moabite, the fourth of documents written in Hebrew, and the fifth of documents written in Aramaic. The documents are thus grouped together on a basis of the script and language in which they are written. They are, however, of different types, and it may be helpful to the reader to provide a brief survey of them, and to give some indication of the way in which they are related to the Old Testament and of their approximate dates. A chronological table is appended. The following types of documents may be distinguished. 1. Epics, legends and myths. The volume opens with extracts from 2 Babylonian epics, the Epic of Creation, around 1750 to 1400 BC, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, around 2000 to 1800 BC, into the second of which the Babylonian story of the flood has been written. The extracts from the Epic of Creation are presented on a basis of a new analysis of stanza division and newly identified text of the hitherto fragmentary 5th tablet. There are 7 in all are included. The unusual view is advanced that the Epic of Creation has no connection of any kind with the account of the creation in Genesis. The Babylonian story of the flood, however, contains material closely similar in substance to certain themes in the flood story as found in Genesis. The texts from Ras Shamra, around 1400 BC, which embody legends and myths, reveal in all its nakedness the type of popular religion in Canaan which the prophets attack so vehemently. They are important not only for the study of the religion of the Old Testament, but also for the light they throw on Hebrew literary conventions and on the Hebrew language, to which the Semitic dialect of the text is closely allied. Yeah, because as we did in the previous video, it all stemmed from the Hebrew originally, all these Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian myths, and the Mesopotamian is probably included with that. The extracts presented are from the legend of King Keret, the legend of Akhat, son of Danal, and the Baal myths. 2. A legal text. It has long been known that the law code of Hammurabi, king of Babylon, around 1792 to 1750 BC, bears many resemblance to ancient Hebrew law, Mosaic law, the Torah, Book of Instruction, and it probably is very, very similar, as we found in another book, to that of the Mosaic law, the older Shurapapat, king of Shurapapat laws. Extracts from the Babylonian code are given and parallels with the Pentateuchal laws noted. 2. Historical texts. These form the great majority of the text. The disturbed situation in Palestine around 1400 BC, to which invaders who are called Hebrews largely contributed, is described in letters to the Pharaoh sent by Abdeheba, governor of Jerusalem. These letters were found at Tel al-Mana in Egypt. The Israel stele of Merinta, around 1223-1211 BC, informs us, as the Old Testament does not, of this Pharaoh's Palestinian campaign, and contains references to the plundering of Canaan and the desolation of Israel, the only reference to the name Israel in any Egyptian inscription. The kings of Assyria from the 9th to the 7th centuries BC have left records of their interventions in the west, in which references to Israel and Judah and their kings are frequent. Ahab's defeat at Karaka in 853 BC and the tribute imposed upon Yehu are recorded by Shalmaneser III, 859 to 824 BC. The Old Testament tells us nothing directly of Israel's recognition of Adad Nirari III, 810 to 782 BC. This Assyrian king claims, however, to have received tribute from her. Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BC, mentions Menahem, Pekah, and Hoshea, kings of Israel, as well as Ahaz and perhaps to Azariah, both kings of Judah. Tiglath-Pileser's son and successor Shalmaneser V, 727 to 722 BC, besieged Samaria for 3 years. It fell in 722 BC to the next king of Assyria, Sargon II, 722 to 705 BC. And with its fall, the northern kingdom of Israel came to an end. Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BC, gives a vivid account of his siege in Jerusalem in 1701 BC, and of the tribute imposed upon King Hezekiah. Sennacherib's attack on Lachish, and the obscure circumstances of his death are also recorded. Another Judean tributary to Assyria, Manasseh, is mentioned by Esarhaddon, 681 to 669 BC. 2 royal inscriptions in Aramaic throw welcome light on the long struggle of Israel with Syria. The first, belonging to the middle of the 9th century BC, is the monument of Bar-Hadad, son of Tab-Ramon, which is dedicated to the god Milkat. This Bar-Hadad is probably Ben-Hadad 1 Kings 15:18. The second inscription, which is to be assigned to the middle of the 8th century BC, is the inscription of Zakir, king of Hamath and Luash, in commemoration of his victory at Hazarach over Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, king of Syria, 2 Kings 13:24, and his allies. To the last quarter of the 9th century BC belongs the Moabite stone, which preserves the account of the victories of Mesha, king of Moab, over Israel. There is something of a discrepancy between the Old Testament narrative and the record on the stone. For whereas in the Old Testament, 2 Kings 3:5 FF, Mesha's revolt against Israel is said to have occurred after Ahab's death. The stone, with the authority of a contemporary document, makes it clear that it took place in the latter years of the Israelite king. The stone has thus important historical links with the Old Testament. It gives much information also about the language and religion of the Hebrew Bible. The language of Moab was closely akin to Hebrew, more akin to it indeed than to any other Semitic language, and Chemosh was Moab's national god in much the same way as Yahweh was Israel's. The date of the potsherds from Samaria, invoices or labels sent with oil and wine from crown property to the king of Israel, is uncertain. They could belong to the 9th or the 8th century BC, more probably perhaps to the latter. Many of the personal names mentioned in them are found in the Old Testament and have considerable significance for the understanding of Hebrew religious ideas. The Siloam inscriptions also belong to the 8th century BC. It was cut into the rock when the tunnel which connects the Virgin Spring with the pool of Siloam was constructed. This tunnel was in all probability made by Hezekiah, king of Judah, 2 Kings 20:20, and may have been built between Sargon's capture of Samaria in 722 BC and Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC. The age of Jeremiah is illustrated by a number of documents. In Nineveh, the age of Jeremiah is illustrated by a number of documents. Nineveh, over those impending fate, the prophet Nahum rejoiced exultantly, is now known from the Babylonian Chronicle to have fallen to the Babylonian and the Median and Scythian allies in 612 BC, and not, as previously thought, in 606 BC. A papyrus from Saqqara in Egypt contains a letter to the Pharaoh around 603 BC, or perhaps somewhat later, written in Aramaic from Adon, king of some Semitic kingdom, possibly Ashkelon. It asked the help of the Pharaoh against the advancing troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, 605 to 562 BC, in much the same way as Abdi-Heber, governor of Jerusalem, had sought help from Egypt 8 centuries earlier in the Amarna age. Several of the documents relate to Nebuchadnezzar. There is the record of his expedition to Syria and of his liberation of the district and people of Lebanon, of his crushing defeat of the Egyptian army at Carchemish in 605 BC, a victory which may have influenced Jeremiah in his policy of submission to Babylon, and of his capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. The exact date of the last event is now known for the first time. The city fell on 16 March of that year. Jehoiachin, king of Judah, was taken to Babylon, and from tablets discovered there, dated 595 to 570 BC, we learn of the rations supplied to him and his 5 sons during their captivity. A highly interesting sequel to the narrative in 2 Kings 24:11 FF. Jehoiachin was restored to favour by Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, 562 to 560 BC. As we are informed by Jeremiah 52:3 or 31 double F, and for his allowance there was a continual allowance given him of the king of Babylon, every day a portion until the day of his death, all the days of his life. Verse 34, compare 2 Kings 25:27 F. 2 further documents relate to the period of Jeremiah. The Babylonian Chronicle throws light on the conflict of Pharaoh Necho II with Judah, which resulted in the death of Hosea on the battlefield of Megiddo in 609 BC. Compare 2 Chronicles 35:20 WF and Jeremiah 22:10. The letters from Lachish around 590 BC reflect the historical situation in Palestine just prior to the end of the southern kingdom in 587 BC, when Zedekiah was on the throne of Judah. Compare Jeremiah 34 verse 7. They contribute to Old Testament study in a variety of ways. On the use of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH or Yahweh, the operation of fire signals, the kind of script used by Judeans at the time of Jeremiah, the textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, the historical development of the Hebrew language, and Hebrew proper names. On all these and other matters, the letters have much to teach. From the period of the Babylonian exile, there are texts relating to Nabonidus, king of Babylon, 556 to 539 BC, and to Cyrus, king of Persia, 558 to 530 BC. In 539 BC, Cyrus took Babylon, and by his edict, or his decree or law, of 553 BC, Ezra 1-2 WF, the Jews were enabled to return home to Palestine from exile in Babylon. A few details concerning the fall of Babylon are supplied by the Nabonidus Chronicle. The Cyrus Cylinder, however, gives a fuller account of it. Two sets of documents belong to the 5th century BC. First, there are the papyri, written in Aramaic, from Elephantine, an island in the Nile. The dated texts cover almost the whole of the century, while they bear upon the history of the Old Testament, for example, upon the much debated question of the relative order of Nehemiah and Ezra. It is rather for the history of Hebrew religion that they are significant. The 4 texts presented in this volume relate to the religious practice of the Jewish colony in the island, a practice which reflects the popular pre-exilic religion of Canaan. They inform us that the temple there, dedicated to Yahoo, was destroyed by the mob at the instigation of the Egyptian priests, and that the community made efforts at Elephantine to secure authority to rebuild it. The existence of this temple at Elephantine raises difficult problems when considered in connection with the law of the central sanctuary in Deuteronomy 12:5 WF. It is of rather special interest that the so-called Passover papyrus was sent to the Jewish community by the king of Persia himself, Darius II, in 419 BC. The second set of documents from the 5th century are the Murashu tablets, written between 455 and 403 BC. They were found at Nippur, southeast of Babylon, and belong to the business house owned by the Murashu family. Some of the personal names found in them occur also in the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, while the tablets clearly show that there were Jews in central and southern Babylonia in the 5th century BC. Murashu and his sons appear not themselves to have been Jews. 4. Wisdom text. The Old Testament itself recognizes that Israel had no exclusive possession of wisdom literature. 1 Kings 4:30f. Jeremiah 69:7. Obad 8. Recent years have seen the discovery of a number of Sumerian, Babylonian and Egyptian works which testify to the existence of this extra Israelite wisdom and to the similarity of many of its main characteristics to those of Israelite wisdom literature. The Babylonian Councils of Wisdom, around 1500 to 1000 BC, or earlier, in many respects resembles the Book of Proverbs. The Babylonian Theodicy, around 1400 to 1000 BC, which is concerned with the suffering of the righteous, falls into the same category as the Book of Job, and the Babylonian Shamash hymn, around 1000 BC, reflects the sun god's interest in moral conduct. The instruction for King Merikare, around 2150 to 2080 BC, the works of an Egyptian sage, is likewise concerned with morality and just dealing, and contains many parallels to the language of the 8th century prophets and other Old Testament passages. Some kind of relationship may exist between the Egyptian work, a dispute over suicide, from around 2280 to 2000 BC, and the Book of Job. While no direct relationship can be claimed between any of these works and the Old Testament writings which they resemble, the case is remarkably different when another Egyptian work, the teaching of Amenemope, around 1300 BC, is compared with the Book of Proverbs. That a part of the Book of Proverbs, 22:17 to 24:22, betrays literary dependence upon this Egyptian work is no longer open to doubt, and the text of the Book of Proverbs can frequently be restored by reference to it. The widely current cycle of Assyrian folklore and wisdom, known as the words of Ahika, may go back in origin to about the middle of the 7th century BC. It is preserved in a fragmentary Aramaic version of the 5th century BC, written on papyrus from Elephantine, but is here translated in the main from a 17th century Syriac manuscript, in which the text can be more fully studied than in the older fragmentary version. The work shows similarities amounting sometimes to identity with the books of Psalms, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. 5. Hymns and prayers. The Babylonian hymn to Shamash has already been mentioned. In it, the Mesopotamian sun god, whose all-seeing eyes rove the universe, is praised as the giver of light and for the care he bestows upon all creatures. The Babylonian prayer to any god, from around 700 BC, contains features which are found in the penitential psalms of the Old Testament, such as confession of sin and a plea for pardon, and a certain resemblance to Old Testament penitential psalms is observable in the Egyptian penitential psalm from around 1290 to 1220. From the religious point of view, however, these Babylonian and Egyptian compositions show none of the noblest features of their Old Testament counterparts. The Egyptian hymn to Aten, around 1370 BC, has much in common with Psalms 104, in a direct relation BC. So that would be, as we found in a rather old hymn book, the Son of Righteousness, SUN. Somebody wrote it or rewrote it as a song, a church song, and it was in this old songbook, and it had the statement underneath. It was probably borrowed from this hymn of Aten, very close to it. A direct relationship between the two compositions has indeed been claimed. 6. Letters. The Old Testament contains but few examples of letter writing. The letters in Akkadian from Tel El Amarna, in Hebrew from Lachish, and in Aramaic from Elephantine add significantly to the material now available for the study of the epistolary style prevalent throughout the ancient Near East. 7. Love songs. The extracts from collections of Egyptian love songs belonging to the period of the later Egyptian Empire, around 1300 to 1100 BC, offer interesting parallels to the Song of Songs. 8. A tale. The Egyptian story, the tale of the two brothers, from around 1210 BC, has often been compared with the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39. The claim that the Egyptian story is the origin of the incident described in Genesis scarcely seems tenable. Markedly absent in the Egyptian story is the religious element with which the Old Testament story is informed. 9. An agricultural calendar. A small tablet discovered at Gezer bears what is probably the most ancient inscription known in early Hebrew script. It may be as old as the age of Saul or David, around 1000 BC. The agricultural, it's a different Saul. It's not Saul of Tarsus or Paul of Tarsus. This is King Saul, right? In the Old Testament. The agricultural operation, which it catalogues, are of much interest in connection with Old Testament agricultural matters. 10. Seals. Seals and seal impressions with inscriptions in early Hebrew characters date from the 9th century BC and onwards, and are important for the contribution they make to the study of Hebrew paleography, proper names, and representational art. Familiar names are met with, such as Jeroboam, Gedaliah, Eliakim, Jotham, and Hananiah, but their identification with persons known from the Old Testament is a matter of much uncertainty. 11. Weights. A number of weights belonging to the 6th century BC and onwards, with the denomination inscribed upon them in early Hebrew characters, have been unearthed in Palestine. One of them bears doubtfully the word shekel. Some are inscribed with the word netzef, half, perhaps of the heavy shekel, and others with the word bekah, half shekel. The most interesting, however, are those found at Lachish and inscribed with the word pim, for they enable a long-standing difficulty in the text of 1 Samuel 13:21 to be satisfactorily cleared up. 12. Coins. Coins do not appear in the Old Testament until post-exilic times. The Persian gold, darik, is mentioned in Ezra 269 and Nehemiah 770 FF. Especially important are coins of the 4th century BC with the word Yehud, i.e. Judah, inscribed upon them, for they make it impossible to carry investigations further into the organization of the Jewish state in post-exilic times under Persian rule. Later, 135 to 37 BC, come the coins struck during the Maccabean period, with Jewish emblems impressed upon them in addition to inscriptions in early Hebrew script. They have a special value as testifying to the religious and nationalistic spirit of the age. The chronological tablet which follows is intended to be no more than a useful appendix to the present survey. The dates of the documents which are given are mostly based upon these, or those which are to be found in the introductions to the documents or in the notes. In a few cases where a date has not been mentioned elsewhere in the volume, it has been supplied in the table.